Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, man, that was sad. I know there's only a few in here, but good morning, everybody. Good morning. There we go. Thank you. Quality, not quantity. There we go. Well, we're going to get going today with this, our 8th session, somehow, of this study, Stained Glass People, which has been on the lives of the saints and how the lives of the saints serve as examples for us, not just in terms of living lives of holiness, but can show us what it looks like to follow Jesus. And we've studied a bunch of different saints up till now, and we're making a pretty significant historical leap. We're jumping ahead a few hundred years from where we were last week, because I realized we were never going to get to modern day if I kept on my other schedule here, because there were too many good saints. And so we're skipping ahead a couple of centuries to the 12th through the 15th century. So the 1100s to the 1400s, okay, is what we're looking at today. We've got 4 saints to talk about. All of these actually should be, in name at least, familiar. And so I'm hoping that we can learn about them a little bit. Now, I've titled this Heading Toward a Reformation because we are literally in history headed towards the Reformation. The last saint that we're going to look at today is Julian of Norwich, and Julian dies in the same century as Martin Luther is born. Okay, and so next week we're going to talk about the Reformation, but we're basically butting right up against it in today's session. And you'll actually notice that underneath a lot of the saints that we're going to study today is this theme of either reform in the life of the church or pushing back against a lot of excesses or, what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of scandal, another word for this, controversy. There's some word that would really encapsulate what I'm trying to say here, but it's not coming to my mind. But y'all get what I'm saying, right? The church had gone too far, is basically. And we've sort of seen this progress a little bit by little bit, right? We started out with the church being actually an oppressed minority, right? I mean, the Christians under the Roman imperial rule were not faring so well. They were in and out of various levels of persecution throughout their existence until the year 325, when the Emperor Constantine declares Christianity a legal faith in the Roman Empire and converts to Christianity himself. But even still, Christians were by no means the dominant force throughout the world until really centuries later. And the past couple of sessions, we've seen how the church became more dominant, especially across the Near East and Europe. And along with that came some challenges, because the church and its authority started to intertwine with the civic authority, and out of that was born a lot of problems. Problems that actually have some contemporary analog in modern political debate. But we won't get into that right now. That's for a future time. And by a future time, I mean my Christ the King sermon, so which is coming up in a few weeks. So today we're going to talk about, as I said, the 12th through the 15th centuries. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this slide because this is how every presentation has started, with what is a saint, and we've talked about how that's hard to define. And the reason I won't really spend any time on this is my whole sermon is about this today, for All Saints' Day. So we're going to blaze through that and just say that a saint, we've talked about saints as being kind of two things. Saints are not just the people that we commemorate in stained glass, hence the name of the class, but they are also people for whom God's grace and glory shines through their life in a particular way, right? So they're stained glass people in more ways than one. They're not just people we may put in a stained glass window, but they're also people who live in such a way that their lives show God's grace through it. And so, let's begin. I realize that, like usual, and y'all know, if you've been to more than one of these, you know that I only loosely stick to all of the notes that I put in here, and it gets me in trouble, and I did that today because my introductory notes are actually on this slide and not the other one. So let me make sure I didn't ignore anything y'all need to know. No, actually, I covered it all, so very good. Okay, as I mentioned, we will talk about the Reformers next week. That's really the only thing in here. So let's start. Let's begin. The saints we're going to look at today, I'm going to go ahead and give you a spoiler right at the beginning. The saints we're talking about today are St. Francis of Assisi, okay? St. Richard, who I think we need to talk about because he's our patron saint, and then John Wycliffe, okay, and St. Julian of Norwich, all right? And I've tried, as y'all have noticed in previous sessions, I try to group the saints that we look at by either geography or influence or something like that, right, that they all kind of tie together. And these, because of the span of history, I mean, each of these people, as you'll notice in the dates, I mean, this is like a 300-year span of history. So they don't overlap in the same way that some of the other saints we've studied have, but I do think in the background of each of these lies that theme of church reform and pushing back against the church's oppression of people, the church's exploitation of people, and that kind of thing. And this word that I can't seem to think of, corruption. There it is. The corruption of the church, like a very basic word that I just could not think of, but there it is, the corruption of the church. And so you'll see that as sort of a theme underneath each of these saints, I think. So let's talk about Francis of Assisi. St. Francis is probably one of the most famous contemporary saints. I mean, you can buy him as like a garden gnome. You know what I mean? And put a little statue of St. Francis and put him in your garden. We've got one right out here. St. Francis's feast day at the beginning of October is a big day because a lot of churches do pet blessings. We blessed a lot of pets in the pumpkin patch this year, and everybody loves pets, right? Everybody loves taking their dog to church. Or whatever it is. And so St. Francis has a lot of enduring appeal, but not just because of pets, but also because of his life and witness and how influential it was. And he has an incredibly interesting life story. He was born in Assisi in Umbria, which is in Italy, in the year 1181. Let's see. I need to turn off my notifications. So he was born in 1181-ish or 1182. We're not exactly sure. But his father, Pietro Bernardone, I'm going to go with. I'm going to try to, I don't know. But I think that's right, Bernardone. Returned from a trip to France. So Francis was born into a really wealthy family. His dad was a merchant, and he spent a lot of time in what is now France, selling his cloth mostly, but a lot of stuff. And he came back from one of these trips to France to find out that his wife had given birth to a son. And his father Francis's father was upset because his wife had had this new son baptized under the name Giovanni, okay, which is Italian for John, right? It sounds fancy because it's Italian, but it's literally just John. And so it's kind of like Giuseppe Verdi, the composer. That sounds really fancy, but his name is literally Joseph Green, which in English, you know what I mean? Like, anyway. But she had him baptize Giovanni after John the Baptist, and this made his dad really mad because the last thing that Pietro wanted was his son to be a man of God. Okay? He was not much for this Christian faith business. He instead wanted him to be a man of, like, other business, of commerce. He wanted to take up the family's business and grow the business. And in particular, he wanted his son to sort of share his infatuation with France. His dad was like really into France. And so Pietro renamed his son Francesco, which literally is the equivalent of calling him Frenchman, right? Francis, from France, right? So that's what he did. And Francis enjoyed a very easy life, like I said, growing up rich. And he partied. He partied hard, okay? He was very notoriously a partier. He was charming. People talked a lot about his natural leadership abilities. He was a very charismatic person. He was very well liked. So anyway, so he was just this sort of hard partying, vivacious individual. People were really drawn to him as a person. And so he was he was popular. Like, he had this little crowd of people who spent their nights partying with him. They wanted to be part of his entourage. And Francis would later say of this time in his life that he lived in sin during this time. This was his own kind of understanding of this period of his life. He was this, again, hard partying kind of guy who, I guess modern day equivalent would be he and his entourage would go from club to club, right? I don't know what they did in Italy in the 1100s, but that equivalent, right? And up until this point in his life, actually during this point in his life, he was fulfilling all of his father's hopes, right? He was suave, he was well liked by people, he was doing, which made the business boom, right? Because if you're selling stuff to folks, people like you, you'll sell a lot of fabrics. And he also fell in love with France. Francis loved France. He loved the songs of France, the romance of France, and especially the free, adventurous sort of troubadours of France who wandered around Europe. So he was kind of, enraptured with this. He was a Francophile, I guess we might say now. But Francis wanted more than just wealth, right? He had everything he wanted, but he wanted more. And even though he wanted more than wealth, what he didn't want was holiness. One biography I looked at said of Francis. Instead, he wanted to be nobility. Even though he came from a wealthy family, it wasn't a noble family, so he wanted to become a knight. And so he wanted to go into battle because that was the best place to win glory and prestige and honor, right? And so he gets his first chance to do this when Assisi, because you have to think about the fact, right, that France and Italy, they're not countries at this point. They're like these small little kingdoms that all kind of fight with each other most of the time. And so Assisi, where Francis is from, declares war on their longtime enemy, the nearby town of Perugia in Italy, okay? And so most of the troops from Assisi were butchered in the fight, and only those wealthy enough to expect to be ransomed were taken prisoner. And Francis was one of these people who was taken prisoner because they thought, well, he's worth more to us alive than he is dead, so we're going to take him prisoner. Finally, at this point, Francis finds himself in this elite circle of nobles, but he's chained in prison, captured, right? So it's not turning out so well. And he stays in the dungeon for a year, okay? He stays in prison for over a year, and then finally he's released, and people, think, well, maybe he'll have a change of heart, except he doesn't. He gets out, and he goes back to partying as much as he did before, okay? So that was not, like we have a lot of saints, Patrick being one of them, is like captured by pirates and then has this like spiritual epiphany or something. Francis did not have that while he was captured. He just wanted to get back out to the bar. Okay, that was Francis's spiritual epiphany. But he wanted glory, right? He wanted honor and glory and fame. And so he gets another chance because there was a call up for knights to go and fight the Fourth Crusade. Okay? And so he wanted to go and fight in the Crusades, not out of a sense of piety or Christian duty, but because he wanted glory, fame, and honor, right? That's what he wanted. And so he was wealthy, so he had a suit of armor made for him, and he had got this horse, so he was, he looked good. He looked the part, and he gets ready to go off to the Holy Land to fight in the crusade. And he never got further than a day's ride from Assisi. Because while being in prison didn't do anything for him, apparently getting ready to head off to battle did. And there he had a dream, a day's ride out from his hometown, in which God told him that he had his entire life wrong and that he needed to turn around and go home. After all this, after getting his armor made and his horse ready and all that, he turns around and goes back home. And was kind of embarrassed and humiliated by this because he didn't even make it, right? Not only did he not fight, but he didn't even go all the way. He turns around a day's journey from home and comes back to his village, and his father was furious, right? He's furious because he'd spent all this money on this armor and whatever. And Francis didn't even go to fight. And so after Francis has this vision, he begins to spend more time in prayer. And he, like many saints that we've noticed, he goes off in seclusion. He goes to a cave, and he has there this kind of spiritual reckoning. He weeps for his sins. He's overwhelmed with this sense of God's grace and mercy. Anyway, and it changes his life. It changes his life. Now, he's still kind of overseeing the family business during this time, and so he's had this spiritual epiphany, but he's still not like Francis as we know Francis, right? The guy in this photo with his burlap, robes on and all that sort of stuff. But what happens is one day it said that while riding through the countryside, he has this encounter with a leper. He's this leper. He's got this really deformed face, and Francis is initially really repelled by his appearance and also by this man's smell. He's just, but he's compelled somehow to jump off of his horse, and he goes and he kisses the hand of this man with leprosy, and this leper kisses Francis back. And it's said that as Francis rides away on his horse, he's just filled again with this overwhelming sense of joy. And he turns around to wave at the leper, and the leper has disappeared. And Francis conceives of this as actually having been a test from God. That God placed that leper there to see what Francis would do, and that Francis passed the test by getting off of the horse and by giving this man the kiss of peace. And so this is another formative kind of spiritual encounter for Francis. And another one happens very famously. This is sort of the final of these spiritual encounters that Francis has that changes his way of living. And he ends up in this ancient church at San Damiano, and he goes in and he's praying there. And while he's praying, it's like the church is in ruins. It's in tatters. The church itself is falling apart physically. And he's praying there, and he hears Christ on the crucifix in the church speak to him. And he says, Jesus says to him, "Francis, repair my church. Repair my church." Now, Francis he looks around and he thinks, oh, it's literally this church that I'm sitting in that I need to repair. And so Francis goes and he sells a bunch of his family's fabrics, his family's merchandise, to get the money to repair the church. He's like, well, that's easy enough. I've got that. I've got cash. I can make that happen. And so he does that, but his father is absolutely furious about this and sees what Francis did as an act of theft. And so Francis's dad, Pietro, actually brings Francis before the magistrate and the bishop, which are basically the same person, again, because we're now in a time where the church and the state are all kind of uncomfortably the same thing. And so the bishop actually has mercy on Francis. He doesn't think it's theft at all, which makes sense because Francis is trying to give money to the church, right? So the bishop kind of has a little bit of an ulterior motive there. But he's generous towards Francis, and what happens is the bishop demands that Francis return the money to his father and renounce the right to be his father's heir. This is kind of what ends up happening. And so Francis does that and trusting that God will provide. And so Francis, sort of liberated in this way, not only gives back the money that he had gotten to rebuild this church, but he gives up the clothes that he's wearing, everything. He just gives it all back, and he proclaims that Pietro is no longer my father. From now on, I can say with complete freedom, "Our Father who art in heaven," Francis is said to have said. And so this is finally, after all of these little kind of spiritual epiphanies, this is the one that does it finally for Francis. And it's said that wearing nothing but rags, he goes off into the freezing woods singing with joy after this. Okay? So at this point, he begins to attract a following. He devotes his life, he takes a vow of poverty, and he devotes his life to prayer and preaching. Interestingly, he is not ordained. he is later in life ordained a deacon, but kind of against his wishes. He doesn't really want to be ordained. And so most of his life, he's not clergy. He's just this kind of crazy man who's been just transformed by the grace of God. And he starts this, what becomes the Order of the Franciscans, which so-called for obvious reasons, right? And he attracts a really large following. Like, people are really compelled by this man who has just changed his life. Again, he sees poverty. Poverty is actually central to Francis's understanding of holiness, because he sort of sees wealth and riches as the very thing that causes sin to happen, right? It causes us to fight one another for our material well-being. It causes people to be greedy. It causes relationships to be severed. And so to Francis, the most liberated you can be is actually to just eschew all of it and to rely on God alone. That's true liberation and freedom in Christ, because we can't. It's sort of like, earlier in the fall we had this series in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus was having a lot of things to say about money and its corrupting force in our lives. And Francis, that was Francis's witness, right? That he really picked up on that, and that was what he believed, was that without money was kind of the way that we should live as Christians. I mean, it's kind of Francis's thing. He followed the gospel very literally in many ways. He and his companions would go out to preach 2 by 2, which is what Jesus commands his followers to do. So they would go out and preach 2 by 2. People initially would run away when they would see Franciscans because they were afraid that somehow their weirdness was catching. That somehow they would be struck with this idea that they needed to give up everything, and so they would flee from the Franciscans. I think that's hilarious. Anyway, so he was just this man of action. I mean, that was what he did. He lived out his faith. And he believed that all of God's creation was holy, which is why he has this association with animals. It's said that there's this famous story about Francis preaching to the birds in the forest, and they all listened to him, and then when he finished preaching, they all flew away, which is why Francis is often depicted with a bird on his shoulder, or on his hand, or whatever, as a famous story attributed to him. Very, very famously, perhaps most famously of all, Francis, later in his life, while praying, was said to have received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, on his hands, feet, and on his side. And so, while at first he was regarded as this oddity, I mean, over time he became sort of respected in the life of the church, mostly because he would go straight to authority figures and just kind of demand what needed to be done. There's a famous story of him going to the leader, to the Muslim leader, and being like, "We need to stop this fighting thing," And so he was a man of great courage and foolishness in many ways. And so he would go, if he had a problem, he'd go straight to the Pope and be like, "You got to do this differently." And oftentimes he would be thrown out. But also, though, he was sort of gained credibility that way, which is why the Franciscans were the only Christians who were sort of able to operate in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land during this time. And it's still the Franciscans to this day who are the stewards of the Holy City. And anyway, so there you go. Francis is also, on a totally different note, the first that we know of to have done a live nativity. Francis, at Christmas, decided that people should sort of be able to experience what it was really like, and so he brought all these farm animals, and they did a live nativity, and that was the first time that had really been done. So there you go, Francis. But he died relatively early. Years of poverty and wandering around, he traveled around everywhere, made him very ill, and he struggled with blindness. He had what was the medieval equivalent of eye surgery, which was they cauterized his eyes because he had this scar tissue on the inside of them. Probably wasn't very great, but he couldn't see because of that at the end of his life. And he died at the age of 45. So he was this man of just immense influence, but lived a pretty short life, all things considered. So anyway, so that's Francis. I mean, just really interesting. And there's so much more here. I mean, I skipped over a bunch, which is why maybe some of those things seemed a little higgledy-piggledy, but his life is really, really fascinating and still resonates, like I said, today. I mean, he's still one of those saints that people know. And Pope Francis, the current pope, I mean, chose his name after Francis of Assisi, and Francis was the only pope to do that. And so, interesting to think about in our current context as well. So that's Francis of Assisi. Whew, all right. Let's talk about this guy for a little bit, Richard of Chichester, who I feel we need to know something about because he's our patron saint, right? He's our patron saint. So this is the Richard that we are named after, and unlike these other slides where I pulled some picture from some rando place, y'all all should notice this stained glass window because it's in our entryway. And so if you want to see it in real life, you can by going right inside the entryway of the church. But Richard was actually a really interesting saint that enjoyed a pretty high degree of popularity in his own day in England. He lived from 1197-ish to 1253, and he was Bishop of Chichester in England from 1244 to 1253. Okay, and kind of like, so Francis, I didn't really talk about this explicitly, but with Francis, a lot of what Francis was doing in casting off wealth and all that sort of stuff was in direct response to the fact that the church, again, was rife with corruption. And there were a number of practices going on at the time that were not theologically grounded, nor were they probably ethical in any way. Things like simony, the selling of sacraments for money, or any holy thing for money, or of course we're probably all familiar with the selling of indulgences. We talk a lot about that when it comes to the Reformation, which was this idea that you could basically buy your way or a relative's way out of purgatory by paying clergy to pray for them a bunch. It's essentially what it was. And anyway, so there was a lot of corruption going on in the life of the church, and we see this reflected significantly in Richard's life and ministry, and the ways in which the temporal powers, like the kings and whatever, were intertwined in very unhealthy ways with ecclesiastical power. Richard was born in a place called Burford. It's not Buford. So I don't know how the English would say it. But anyway, it's in Worcestershire, where we get the sauce that no one else can pronounce either. And he was, interestingly, he was a member, so he was a child of the landed gentry. He came from a wealthy family, but he was an orphan. His parents died when he was very young, and he was, his older brother was actually so young that he couldn't inherit anything yet. And so they were sort of raised by stewards who oversaw their land. And when his older brother was old enough to actually inherit the estate, there was this death tax that must be paid that basically rendered them in poverty. So even though they were born into wealth, they didn't have any of it because of this. And so Richard grew up an orphan and kind of basically without much promise in many ways. And so Richard ended up going into a life of study. Was basically his one way out of what the situation that he had been in. And so he was, back in those days, the other way you could get back into money was to marry into money. And so there was an attempt to marry off Richard into a wealthy family, and he ended up saying, no, I don't want that. Send her to my brother. I'm going to go to school. And that was kind of that was what happened. So he goes off to Oxford, and he ends up, he's very bright, and he begins to teach, actually, in the university. And from there, he goes on to Paris and Bologna in Italy, where he is distinguished. Those were sort of the centers of learning in that day in continental Europe. And so he goes off, and he's really brilliant. He exceeds in his studies and becomes a canon lawyer and returns to England in 1235 and was elected Oxford's chancellor when he comes back. So he does well for himself. His former tutor, Edmund of Abingdon, becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a convenient friend to have, I guess, if you're in England, right? And Richard shared many of Edmund's ideals of clerical reform that were going on. So there was this movement to reform the excesses of the church, the corruption of the church, again, that was going on. And so in 1237, Archbishop Edmund appoints Richard the Chancellor of the Diocese of Canterbury. Okay, so that's because they shared these ideals. But Richard wasn't a priest. He wasn't ordained. So at this point, he decides to go get ordained. So he goes and studies theology for 2 years with the Dominicans in France, and then comes back to England after that, and became a parish priest at that point. And let's see, and then in 1244, he is elected Bishop of Chichester. Okay, so that's kind of his little route. But this was not without controversy. Henry III, who was the king at the time, and part of the chapter of the diocese, so the people who had to approve of him being bishop, refused to accept him as their bishop because the king favored a different candidate who was more in line with his self, we'll just say, was more in line with the king. And so both sides, in order to end the dispute, go and appeal to the Pope to end the dispute. And the Pope sides with Richard being the bishop, and the king is mad about that. And so we already start to see there's some tension between the King of England and the Pope. It's not this is Henry III, right? We're still a few Henrys away from the famous Henry VIII. But basically what the king says is, okay, well, if you're going to have to be Bishop of Chichester, I'm just going to take all your properties. And so he forbids Richard from being able to live in the bishop's house, and he takes away all of his stuff. And so anyway, so Richard was Bishop of Chichester, but he didn't have the keys to the castle, and he didn't have the diocesan car, you know what I mean, or whatever, he couldn't do it. And so basically, Richard pulls a Francis, and he kind of just walks around the diocese and takes, people's charity, essentially. The king forbade people to house Richard, but they disobeyed anyway, and they let him stay in their house, and he would travel around the diocese. And so because of this, he actually becomes incredibly well-loved by his people because he is their pastor, and he literally is with them all the time, unlike a lot of bishops at the time who hung out in the palace and only showed up for confirmations or whatever. Richard wasn't like that. He walked around on foot, and he displayed a high degree. Some could argue this was forced, but nevertheless, he was a very frugal bishop, very frugal man. And he wore a hair shirt, which we talked about, those itchy shirts made of animal hair that was supposed to be itchy and uncomfortable so that you would think about God more. And he was a vegetarian. Since his days in Oxford, he refused to eat animals. That was part of his thing. So he was a vegetarian. He only ate vegetables. And so while he was known as someone who was very frugal and kind, he was merciless to certain people in the diocese. And one of those were usurers, loan sharks. He hated them. He hated anybody who took advantage of the poor. He was merciless to corrupt clergy and priests. He particularly didn't like clergy who mumbled the Mass, which I think is funny. He thought that was horrible. It was you can't just mumble it up there. It's not just for you. What is this? So he got angry about that. And he really hated clerical privilege. He did not like that. And so he showed a lot of favor to the order of the Dominicans, which were the order that he studied with in France for the priesthood. But they also held a lot of these ideals in England, the Dominicans in England. And so he tried to enact a lot of clerical reform while he was Bishop of Chichester, and that made him very unpopular with the powers that be and the structure of the church. He overruled King Henry on certain occasions, which again was not a way to ingratiate yourself to the monarch, but he didn't care. And he even defrocked a priest who had seduced a nun out of her convent, which was something that happened all the time. It was just sort of well, we won't look at that, And Richard was like, no, that's bad. That's a bad thing. So anyway, so Richard was all about clerical reform and reform in the church. He also imposed severe penance on knights who attacked clergy, so there were, and things like that that were happening at the time. Let's see. And so that was Richard, and he's probably most famous today for that prayer, right, that we also have commemorated in a stained glass window, this prayer that he is said to have said on his deathbed. Thanks be to thee, my Lord Jesus Christ, for all the benefits thou hast given me, for all the pains and insults thou hast borne for me. O merciful Redeemer, friend and brother, may I know thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, and follow thee more nearly. And then the day by day was actually added much later. There's an interesting textual history of this prayer. Richard is, as I said, supposed to have recited this prayer on his deathbed, surrounded by the clergy of the diocese. And the words of the prayer were transcribed in Latin by his own confessor. So, it's pretty sure, there's a lot of prayers ascribed to St. Francis that, we're pretty sure St. Francis didn't say. Like the quote, preach the gospel and if necessary, use words. Absolutely is not something Francis would have said, because Francis preached a lot with words. But in this case, actually, we're pretty sure Richard actually did say a prayer like this when he died, because his own confessor recorded it right around the time of his death. But it's a little bit different than the prayer that we have today, which really comes from a book called the Churchman's Prayer Manual, which was by someone named G.R. Bullock Webster, published in 1913. So the prayer that we have in our window is really from that, is that, and of course was catapulted to global success by the musical Godspell, who turned it into the song Day by Day, right? And so we love that. But that's Richard. So Richard was someone who himself was humble, who traveled around his diocese on foot, was deeply loved by his people, and actually after his death, people would come to the shrine in Chichester Cathedral and pray for many, many decades, really until that sort of thing was done away with a couple of centuries later. So Richard was very well beloved and tried to enact clerical reform in the midst of a system that was determined not to be reformed. So there's Richard. Now John Wycliffe. We'll go pretty quick on Wycliffe so that we can get to Julian. Wycliffe is interesting because, for many, many reasons, because Wycliffe was a clergyman who is often referred to as a proto-reformer, because he's too early to be part of the Protestant Reformation. But he starts to kick off things that become taken up by the reformers in pretty significant ways. Perhaps most famously, that he championed and even did some of the translating himself of a Bible from Latin into English, into Middle English. So he was a believer that the Bible, that the Scriptures, should be read in the vernacular, which is something that becomes a really big deal in the Reformation, that both Scripture and worship should be in the language of the people and not in Latin. And so this was part of what Wycliffe did. Wycliffe had a number of followers during his life that they become known as Lollards derogatorily. The church was trying to kind of do away with them. And in the time of Julian of Norwich, who we'll talk about next, there was even a place outside of Norwich called the Lollard Pit where you would go to be burned, at the stake. That was sort of how the church viewed Wycliffe's followers after his death. Interestingly, during his life, he was actually fairly popular and well-liked, or at least, I won't say well-liked, he was very well-respected, But he did seek to enact clerical reform as well, I'm trying to find my little list of those things, because they are all things that you would, if you're a Protestant, you would know as being part of the Reformation. Things like speaking out against indulgences, simony, all of those things I just mentioned. I mean, that was Wycliffe. That's what he wanted to do. And he was declared a heretic after his death, and he died while saying Mass in his parish church on the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the 28th of December, 1384. He suffered a stroke while celebrating Mass and died. Okay, so he died while doing the Lord's work. And like I said, he was later declared a heretic at the Council of Constance in 1415, and his writings were banned, okay, during that time. In fact, it was ordered after that council that his works should all be burned and his bodily remains removed from where they were. So he was exhumed and burned, and then his ashes were thrown into the river Swift. Okay, that was sort of how the church dealt with John Wycliffe. But as you can see, the reason I wanted to stick him in here is that he's incredibly pivotal and important, and especially as we start to talk about the Reformers, who were a century and a half later. Okay, but Wycliffe was already doing some of this stuff. All right, so let's talk about Julian to end today. And then we'll take just a couple of minutes for discussion. Julian is really, really interesting for a whole host of reasons. Julian was an anchoress, which was basically, an anchoress was someone who relegated themselves to a cell, like a little room where they lived, and they would have like a window. People could come and talk to them and bring them food. Julian was in the middle of the city. It wasn't like she went out into the wilderness like some people did in seclusion. She wasn't in seclusion that way, but she was secluded in the fact, more like sequestered, maybe a better word to use, because she was in this little room in the middle of the city, and you could come to her little window and you could talk to her and ask her for prayer or advice or whatever. And that's what anchoresses would do. They would spend their time in spiritual devotion, and they were almost like Simeon the Stylite, who was up on the pillar, and people would come to Simeon and be like, Simeon, you're, much holier. Could you, this is what's happening to me. Could you give me spiritual advice? And Simeon would dispense advice. Julian did that, but like on the ground. Okay, so she wasn't on a pillar. And Julian is really, really interesting because she is her work, Revelations of Divine Love, is the earliest surviving English language work by a woman, written by a woman. There may have been earlier things written in English by a woman, but we don't know because they were not attributed, right? We don't have the author's name. But Julian is the first that we know wrote a book in English. And the Revelations of Divine Love come from this experience that she had around the age of 30. She gets very, very sick. Very, very sick. And she has these visions while she is sick. And it's this series of visions that she calls showings. And she writes about them and spiritually reflects on them later. The most famous, perhaps, of those visions is she sort of visualizes the universe as the size of a walnut or a chestnut. I can't remember what kind of nut, but it's a nut in the palm of Jesus' hand. And that everything that we think is so vast and big and beyond comprehension, to Jesus is like the size of a walnut in his hand. And this is one of the visions that she relates and reflects upon. And they've been really influential throughout history. I mean, kind of like St. Francis. St. Julian is a saint who has a lot of staying power. Now, in continental Europe at this time, there was this movement, particularly amongst women, of having these mystical visions given to them. Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, is a big one of these in Germany. But Julian is kind of along with a lady named Marjorie Kemp, but we're not going to talk about Marjorie today. But Julian is kind of the English mystic at this time. And her work, see if we can get the lights to come back on. There we go. Very good. And her work has especially these last few years had quite a renaissance during COVID-19 because Julian lived through 2 rounds of the Black Death during her lifetime. And I mean, like, it was like horrible. Historians estimate that the first wave that she lived through was estimated to have killed 40 to 60% of people in England. 40 to 60%. That's a lot. And then wave number 2 killed 20% of the population on top of that. Okay? And so Julian lived through this, and Anyway, and so there's this sense in which a woman receiving these visions from God, these visions that are filled with hope, by the way. I mean, that's part of what the revelations of divine love are all about, is the hope in the midst of just absolute suffering. But someone who is sequestered in a cell during massive medical catastrophe resonates, right? It resonated especially in 2020 and in early 2021. And so there was a great revival of kind of thinking about Julian. And there's a lot of articles online, one in particular from the Anglican Journal, which is a part of a magazine of the Anglican Church of Canada, that wrote about Julian and her influence and kind of the way that people looked to her during COVID as a source of inspiration and faithfulness. The other thing that Julian's very famous for is in these divine kind of showings, she thinks a lot about the nature of God as a mother that births both creation into existence and us into existence in the waters of baptism. And this is something that Julian is also very famous for at a time when conceptions of God were seen very much in patriarchal terms. Julian is really sort of transgressive and writing about the ways in which God is father but also mother, right? That God is genderless, right? Because God's God. Those are human categories we impose upon God, and writes these reflections upon that, and also her relationship with Jesus in these really mystical and intimate terms. And so the Revelations of Divine Love, really incredible, worth reading now, and certainly Julian is someone who's had lasting impact in the life of the church, especially recently, as we went through this time of difficulty and trial during COVID-19. What was, new becomes, or once what we think is old becomes new again, right? And it kind of loops back around itself. So that's Julian. Anybody have any questions about any of these people that we talked about this morning? I mean, I think, like I said, underneath all of them is this backdrop of church corruption and a desire for clerical reform. I mean, Julian even, right, is pushing back against this a little bit in her own ways. And so, any questions? Vulgate. So that's the Latin Bible. It's the Bible translated into Latin. Is called the Vulgate. Because it was the tongue of it was the vulgar tongue at one point, but then it wasn't anymore. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, good question. Yeah, and we talked about Saint Jerome weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks ago, who is the one who translated the Bible into Latin and gave us the Latin Vulgate. But then that became the Bible. There we go. That became the Bible, and then of course no one spoke Latin. So that begat the movement for the Bible to be translated into different languages. So that's a good question, though. Anything else? Anything strike anybody about these saints? Kind of head into the reformers next week. Yeah, Jeff? You're welcome to go again, Jeff. That's fine. Well, I would be interested. What do you mean by that, not good? Because, of course, the prophets themselves have visions, right? You have Ezekiel, and for instance, not only has visions, he's taken up into his visions. And you have Isaiah, same thing. Mm-hmm. Oh, you're talking. Oh, I think yes. So I think you're referring to. There's an instance in the New Testament where there's this young woman who is I can't remember how it's phrased, basically, but she's basically like, not demon-possessed, but she does kind of witchcrafty things, maybe we'll say. And Paul, prays for her, and she converts to Christianity, and then her family, who is making money off of her doing these things, loses their livelihood, and they're kind of mad about it. It happens. And yes, and that's a little bit different than maybe having some sort of dream or vision, because of course, I mean, a lot of the saints, Francis is one of those, a lot of their spiritual revelations happen in the form of dreams, But I do think that it's important to note that there's something always a little scary about dreams and visions, right? There's something unsettling about God greeting you in a vision, whether you're in the Old Testament and you're interpreting visions like Daniel did or Joseph did or whatever. Or whether you're someone who in the life of the church has sort of been shown something by God. There's something unsettling about that sometimes, for certain. Yeah. Yeah, Carol. Oh man, I forgot to mention this. This is where we'll end today, and I think thank you for that reminder. That's perfect. Carol just asked about the miracle of the chalice, which is a story that is ascribed to St. Richard, because of course we talked about how saints, they've got to have miracles, right? They have to have a miracle. At some point you got to do a miraculous thing. And one of the miracles that is ascribed to St. Richard is that he knocks a chalice of wine off of the altar at communion, and it is said that it fell on the ground upright and without spilling. And that was one of the miracles attributed to St. Richard, which is, to me, should make St. Richard the patron saint of all nervous seminarians, right? And altar servers, because if you can knock that off and spill nothing, the altar guild will spare your life. And so St. Richard is with you. But if you look actually in the window there in our entryway, there is at Richard's feet a chalice on the floor, and that's why. Is because that's the miracle that's attributed to him. And so he's often depicted with a chalice by his feet because he was said to have knocked it off. So thank you, because I needed to mention that and I didn't. That's a good, yeah. Yes. So I think it's a great story and a fun. So yeah, to think about Richard as the saint whose miracle had to do with the chalice falling on the ground and not spilling, and the fact that he was unsparing towards priests who mumbled the Mass. He was maybe liturgically a pretty formidable guy. I don't know, but anyway. But thank y'all. I really appreciate your time today on All Saints' Day. What better day to study some more of the saints and their lives and witness to us. And like I said, next week we'll get into the Reformers and start talking about the Reformation. And then I'm thinking what we'll do is we'll take this class up to Advent, and then we'll do something different. So we'll be scooting through some centuries here over the next few weeks. And then we'll look at something else. But thank you so much for being here today, and let us pray to end. The Lord be with you. Good and gracious God, as always, we thank you. We thank you for bringing us here today. We thank you for the witness of your saints who have gone before. We pray that their life, that the way that you worked in and through them, would be a blessing and an inspiration to us as we seek to follow you more faithfully. I pray that we would remember that it is not by our works, but by your grace that we are able to live and move and have our being. So be with us. Bless us, keep us, guide us, and guard us. For it's in your name that we pray. Amen.